Like, what are some common myths that you've heard about empathy that you would like to debunk right here on this podcast?
Empathy is not just being nice, but nice doesn't mean you see my point of view. Empathy is about connection, not conversion. Groups that said they had an empathetic leader and groups that said their leader was not empathetic. How did they seemingly do it with no effort?
Lazy leadership.
They are self-awareness, self-care, clarity, decisiveness, and joy. Empathy has no place in the workplace. They were like, is it a business book or a self-help book? And I'm like, no, it's a business book.
Maria, it is such a pleasure to have you on Transform Your Workplace. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
We're going to talk about your book today. It's called The Empathy Dilemma: How Successful Leaders Balance Performance, People, and Personal Boundaries. I love topics about empathy. And early in the book, you define empathy, which I'm very thankful. You define empathy because everybody's got a little different definition, but you define it as being willing and able to see, understand, and where appropriate, feel another person's perspective and to use that information to act compassionately. How did you land on that definition? I'm sure it's through experience, but why is that distinction of, between empathy and compassion important for leaders also to understand?
Yeah. When I wrote my previous book, The Empathy Edge, which was really the business case of the ROI of empathy, I did years of research on that. And every expert I talked to had its slightly different definition. The definition of empathy has changed over time from the 1700s to today, the more that we've learned about the brain and about psychology. And this just really seemed to fit in the place where it would make sense and be most accessible for people in the workplace, because there's this false belief that empathy at work means I'm nice or that I'm going to be crying on the floor with my employees. And empathy can show up in so many different tactical, operational ways that we may not even think of as empathy. But when you look at it from, am I seeing things from someone else's point of view? And then based on that information that I'm getting, so kind of a method of information gathering, if you will, about someone else's context, now I can take a next right step. And that is what compassion is. Compassion is actually empathy in action. In some models, they discern between cognitive empathy, using your brain to imagine what something might be like for someone, emotional empathy, which is feeling the feelings of someone else. But then they also talk about compassionate empathy, which is where those two things lead. And compassionate empathy is when you're moved to take action. So really, compassion is empathy in action. Now I know what to do next based on what I'm learning from you.
You talked about how empathy is often misunderstood. Like, what are some common myths that you've heard about empathy that you would like to debunk right here on this podcast?
I love it. I love that you're giving me this platform to do this. So kind of like I mentioned earlier, empathy is not just being nice. So sometimes we hear, oh, we have an empathetic culture here. Everyone's nice. But nice doesn't mean you see my point of view. And to be really honest, when we're being nice through the lens of our own experience. What do I think is what's going to make me feel good to do for Brandon today, right? That has nothing to do with your perspective. It doesn't mean I see your perspective and I understand what you're going through. I'm centering myself in the being nice, which I don't want to deter people from being nice, but it's not the same thing, right? We can't just hire a bunch of really nice people to create an empathetic culture. It's also not caving into unreasonable demands, which is the other reason that a lot of leaders hold back and think that empathy has no place in the workplace. You can absolutely balance tough business decisions and do it with empathy. So it doesn't mean that I have to change my mind. It doesn't mean that I have to do what you want. It means I can stick to my strategic decision, even if it's, in some cases having to do layoffs or having to change strategic direction. And I can make space for empathy by bringing other people along in that process, letting them tell me how they feel or how they're impacted, thinking about what they might need for support from their perspective. What questions might they have? What resources might they need? What skills might they need to up-level? That's all putting myself in their perspective and trying to see what they see. And then the one that makes people feel the best, I think, especially in our fractured world, is that it's not about agreeing with someone. So you can have an empathetic conversation where you're really getting curious and trying to understand where someone's coming from, but you don't have to walk away converted. Empathy is about connection, not conversion. So it's really about, okay, I still don't agree with you, Brandon, but now I have a better understanding of why you think the way you do. And you can think of all kinds of other realms in our lives other than the workplace where that could be really useful.
Are there some words or telltale signs that somebody on the other side of the table is being empathetic to your situation? So if I'm coming to you with a problem or I'm experiencing something, and I'm just like unloading on you, Maria, and you're talking back to me, what are some words that you might be using that would make me believe that you're being empathetic to me?
I love this question. I've never actually gotten this question, but it's such an important one.
I just thought of it just randomly.
I know
right
you're brilliant. No, but I think it's about what they say, but it's also about what they do. So if they are asking you questions, if they are saying, wow, that sounds really tough, Brandon, tell me more about that. And how did you feel about that? And what did you think when that person said that? Then you know that they're trying to understand your context. They're trying to center you in the narrative. If they immediately jump to problem solving or advice giving, or what I call empathy hijacking, which is, oh, Brandon, I know exactly how you feel because one time this happened to me and here's everything I did and here's what I know and blah, blah, blah. Now it's not about you anymore, right? It's about me. I'm trying to connect. Actually, the intention for empathy hijacking is pure. I'm trying to connect with you and make you feel less alone. But that might not be what you need in that moment. And again, it's about taking the other person's perspective. So one little trick I have that I talk about in the book that one of the leaders I interviewed share is if someone does come into your office and they're venting or they're upset or they're sad or they're angry or they're confused, you can say, they've obviously got things to say and they want to say them to you. You can pause and say, this is really important to you. I can tell this is really important to you. How can I best serve you in this conversation? Do you want me just to see the problem and be aware of it? Do you want me to actually help you problem solve and offer advice? Or do you just want me to support you? See it, solve it, or support. And let them tell you, no, I'm just venting. My husband does this all the time. Nope, I'm just venting. I want no solutions. I just want to vent, right? And we have to do that for our own people too. But I think, especially when you have a natural inclination to care about other people, and I do this, your instinct is to take away their pain by giving them solutions on how to solve it, right? So, well, did you do this? And did you talk to that person? And you should write them an email and blah, 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 blah. That might not be what they want in that moment. And so we always need to remember that it's, we always talk about the golden rule, do unto others as you would have done unto you. Empathy is the platinum rule. And this is not credited to me. This is credited elsewhere, but it's about do unto others as they would have done unto them. And so it's really about trying to understand their perspective. And I don't like to use the phrase walk in their shoes because when we do that, we're actually still us walking in their shoes and we go through life differently than other people. What I like to think of is, have you ever been at the top of a skyscraper or a monument and there's those binocular things there?
Yeah.
I like to think of it like, oh, I'm seeing something really cool. Brandon, you have to come see this. And now you get in front of the binoculars and you're seeing what I see. Like, I kind of like to think of empathy as that.
That's perfect. When you were talking about this, it reminded me of these two, I think they were viral videos back in the day. One was, it was an animated video by Brene Brown.
I love that one.
And there was one moment, it was like, she's unloading and then there's like this, it was like some sort of animal. It was animated and it was like, but at least you like shifting
they diminished
to
it.
Like problem solving. And it was like, you just totally dismissed what I was saying.
Mm-hmm.
Then the other one was, do you ever see that? It's like a husband and wife and the wife's got a nail in the forehead or something like that. And the husband, all he wants to do is take that nail out. And it was like, just showing that like you want to be able to like pull the nail out and solve the problem. Like the wife just wanted to vent, like you were saying, just wanted to vent, but he's trying to fix the problem. Those are funny. I'll try to.
There's another one for one of her talks. That was the one I thought you were going to mention, which is the person stuck in the well. I don't know if you've ever seen that, which is the difference between sympathy and empathy. Yeah. So sympathy is you're at the top of the well and you're like, wow, sorry about that. That really sucks that you're down at the bottom of the well. I'm paraphrasing. And you're sort of, you're putting yourself, you're distancing yourself from someone. And sympathy is often related to feelings of pity, right? Like you are, ooh, I wouldn't want to be you right now, right? Empathy is the person jumps into the well with them and just sits next to them and puts their arms around them. So I like to think of sympathy as you're feeling something for versus empathy as you're feeling something with someone. And if you can't access that through feeling, if you're not a touchy-feely type person, that's the great news about cognitive empathy is you can access empathy through your brain as well as your heart by just trying to think of what that person's point of view is or asking them. You were asking earlier, what would they be saying, right? Are they asking you questions? Are they getting curious? Curiosity is the number one trait of empathic people because they don't assume your point of view. Yep. They ask you for it.
That's a good distinction. I love that. And I do remember that video of the well one. So I'll make sure to put links to all those videos because I know they're out
they're
there.
So great. Yeah.
Probably millions of views. So this is a pretty powerful part of the book. I asked you about this before we started recording, but you highlighted that empathy doesn't belong in every situation, in every moment. Mm-hmm. And you use your own example from your own life, which is incredibly scary. And I would love for you to share a little bit about that story. We don't have probably enough time to go into all the details of it, but why was empathy not a good thing in this situation when you had a medical procedure?
And that's, that's a little bit of a Trojan horse too, of like, well, it depends on what you think empathy is. And if you think empathy is getting lost in the emotions of someone else and not being clear-headed about what needs to be done, then empathy has no place. But that's the little double-edged sword there.
Yeah.
But I quite a few years ago, 2008, I had an unexpected sudden brain aneurysm rupture. And the point that I make in the book is that there are times where we can't be distracted by empathy in order to do what must be done. And no one knows this better than first responders. And I spoke to a few first responders in this second book, in The Empathy Dilemma as well, to talk to them about how do you separate that? Because empathy is a really important part of care and healthcare. But, one was an emergency room nurse. One was one of my neurosurgeons. And they just talked about the fact that they're able to compartmentalize that you can work the case, but treat the patient. And when it's appropriate to connect emotionally and ask questions and listen, there's a time for that. The time for that is not when you need to get in there and rush someone into the ER and cut open their skull. Like that's not the time. And you need to rely on your own expertise. Not that you're going to ignore the family or ignore explaining anything, but there's a moment where you have to put your own feelings aside. I would not want my surgeon operating on me clouded by, oh my gosh, at the time, they just got married 2 years ago. Like she's young and healthy. What's going to happen if she doesn't come out of this? I don't want him thinking about any of that at the time. I want him to strictly be looking at me as a case in that moment because that's what I need to save my life. And so there are moments, I don't know that there's that many applicable moments from a workplace perspective, unless you are a first responder. And I talk about some of those stories in the book, but, there really is always room for empathy if we truly understand, as we talked about earlier, what empathy is and isn't. So there's an argument to be made that if you do believe empathy is people pleasing and you do believe empathy is crying on the floor with your employees, then absolutely there are times when empathy is not appropriate. If you look at empathy as just trying to see someone else's perspective and understand their context and connect with them, then empathy is always appropriate in any place where two humans have to interact.
I think empathy is hard in the workplace. Like you said earlier, I am actually one of those touchy-feely people. So empathy to me comes a little easier. However, I am wondering if there is some sort of generational clash that prohibits us from being more empathetic in the workplace. I'm just speculating. I know you talked about it a little bit in your book, but what is your take on whether generations make a difference?
Yeah, I have a whole chapter on why empathy at work is hard, because if you talk to anybody, they all agree it's a good idea. But when it comes to practicality, and one of those challenges to it is generational conflict. And we have, I'm sure you've cited this before, we have 5 generations working in the same workplace in today's world. And it's rife with misunderstanding and misperception. And so kind of going beyond the stereotypes, really just understanding that there is no right and wrong. There's just different, right? And so the way a traditionalist or a boomer looks at the world of work, looks at workplace culture, looks at the definition of professionalism or good communication or access to information, that's very different than other generations in the workplace. And so what we default to is an adversarial, you're doing it wrong, right? Whether it's coming from the boomers or it's coming from Gen Z, the immediate response is you're doing it wrong. Instead, if we would embrace empathy to try to leverage that as a connection opportunity. So now I want to get curious. I'm a Gen Zer. I want to get curious. Why does my baby boomer boss hoard information, or my traditionalist boss like hoard information? Why don't they ever share anything with me? Why don't they trust us enough, right? To actually have that conversation and understand. And this is based on the work of Anna Lyotta, who wrote a book called Unlocking Generational Codes. That's one of the best books I've ever read about generational conflict.
I'll pick that up.
You should have her on the show. She's great. But she talks about the fact that every generation has an operational code. And we just need to understand what that code is and get curious and have conversations with each other so that it's not misunderstanding. So now I as a Gen Zer can say, oh, I understand your generation because of things that happened around the time you were 11 or 12, which is what Anna claims creates our operational code. You see information as power. You see it as something that cannot be shared. Whereas in my generation, we see information as democratic. We see it as something to be shared in order to solve problems. You can see how there'd be misunderstandings there and how it impacts the workplace. And so the more that we can embrace empathy in those moments of conflict, instead of saying, I'm right and you're wrong, think about our common ground, which is that we want to do our best work here. We want our company to succeed. We want to hit our quarterly or annual targets. Now, can I have a conversation to try to understand you better versus just making all these assumptions up in my head? And that's where we can actually overcome a lot of generational conflict. And one of the things I recommended in my first empathy book, The Empathy Edge, was creating intergenerational mentorship relationships. And not just so the older person can mentor the younger, but can the younger person teach the older person about social media or about video production and editing or, whatever it is that is their particular strength. I sound like I'm quoting stereotypes here, but you know what I mean? There's learning to be done both ways. And I think we don't value that enough because we're assuming I'm right and you're wrong.
Yep. COVID-19 pandemic. Do you think that made people more empathetic or less? From my vantage point, more, because we're all kind of going through this thing together. I worked with a bunch of HR consultants too, and they had like the compassion fatigue going on. And I feel for those folks. And, I did a whole podcast on that too. It's a real thing.
Yeah.
So walk me through that period. And then where does that lead us to as of today? Like more empathetic, less? Just what's your take on that?
Yeah, it's funny because I wrote The Empathy Edge. I researched it and wrote it, and it came out in the fall of 2019.
Oh, jeez.
And then
you had no idea what was about to happen.
I had no idea what was about to happen. And when I was shopping it around to agents before it ended up getting published, they didn't understand. They were like, is it a business book or a self-help book? And I'm like, no, it's a business book. And at the time, they didn't understand how those two things could coexist, right? Then the pandemic happened. My work flourished. I'm sad that it took a global pandemic for people to get the concept that we're human beings at work and we can't park our humanity at the door. Just, whatever's happening to me in the outside world is going to affect my ability to do a financial spreadsheet accurately. Like it just, we were naive to think it was any other way, right? And so then people started to get it. They started to understand, oh, wait, we're dealing with people here, not just resources. They are being globally impacted by this. Their families, their lives are being turned upside down. And it's impacting, to be really crass, their productivity and engagement. And then they started to put the dots together about we need to be flexible. We need to be empathetic. We need to listen. We need to understand that people are whole and they don't just compartmentalize when they come to work. Everything impacts them. Everything from lack of childcare to family being sick to, death all around them. Like it all impacts them. And so I don't know. I don't believe that the trend was not even there before, because all of my research pointed to the fact that what at the time was considered the future of work was going to be more people-centered, was going to be more flexible, was going to be more empathetic. The pandemic just accelerated it.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
So we had no choice but to strap in and hold on. Like, just, it was happening. And so we can't even talk about the future of work anymore, because it's the new world of work. Like, it's here now.
And so you would say like that the pandemic accelerated our empathy muscle a little bit, and it's here to stay.
It is. I mean, we have seen a little bit of a backlash from leaders that, operating out of fear. They want to go back to the status quo because it served them. And so, no, I need everybody back in the office because work only gets done within four walls, right? We proved during the pandemic that that's not the case. There are times when in-person collaboration is important. It doesn't mean it can't happen, outside of four walls. So we are seeing a little bit of what I call a snap back to bossism. And that's fear talking. That's fear of.
It's also lazy leadership.
It's lazy, but it's also, I want to give a little bit of to some of them, a good intention of they just don't know how to lead in the hybrid environment. They don't know how to lead in remote. Their whole career was built on a certain premise of leadership. And that paradigm of leadership is dying. So I actually have a lot of empathy for those folks that are like, well, what I've done for 30 years, now people are pulling the rug out from under me and telling me, no, you have to care about people's personal lives. You have to listen to them talk. You have to let them have a say. I don't know what all this is, right?
But much like the world and business is changing all around us, as leaders, we have to evolve with the changing times. The needs of people are changing.
Yes.
Unless you're going to have a office full of robots or something and AI, you're going to have to learn to flex with people.
Right.
And it does take that connection, is that understanding of what do you need?
For sure. And that's, I always say when I've done a lot of workshops and leadership trainings and talked to a lot of HR professionals. And they're actually the reason I wrote this second book, The Empathy Dilemma, because they were like, cool. We get it. We're on board with this whole human-centered thing, but here's where it gets hard. And so the second book is more, this new book is more for the converts of how do I do this? How can I be enabled to be empathetic and high performing at the same time and protect my own mental health in the process? To your point about empathy fatigue, how do I do it in a way where I can keep my boundaries and not just cave into people pleasing all the time?
Yeah.
So it's a change, but it's coming, it's here, whether people want it or not. And if you want your business to be sustainable and you want to be successful for the long haul, it's going to behoove you to, embrace this new leadership paradigm and take a growth mindset and say, yeah, there's something more I can learn here.
Well, we're 22 minutes in and we haven't even got to the 5 principles that are part 2 of your book. So let's get into that, and we'll uncover the how.
Yeah.
We're not going to get into every little detail because that's the core of your book and the how we can, create empathy inside of our workplaces. So you have 5 pillars of effective empathetic leadership in part 2 of your book. Can you share what those 5 are? And don't get too deep into it. We're going to go through.
Yeah, we can do really high level, but yeah, they are, it's very important. They're the 5 pillars of both effective and empathetic leadership. How can you be both and at the same time? And these are common threads that I discovered from interviewing hundreds of successfully empathetic and high performing leaders. And I was trying to deconstruct the recipe. How did they do it? Right? How did they seemingly do it with no effort and balance everything and still keep their, mental health and everything in check? They are self-awareness, self-care, clarity, decisiveness, and joy. And the reason they're presented as pillars is if you are struggling with balancing empathy and accountability, or empathy and your own mental health, you may want to look at this framework and look at these pillars and see where you might need to strengthen one of them, because that could be where the challenge is that you're having. So self-awareness, know yourself, understand what you bring to the interaction, the energy, your emotional triggers, your strengths, your challenges. Have a growth mindset about that, what you're good at and what you're not, because then you can be more present, and you kind of got to get your own house in order before you can make room to be empathetic without defensiveness or fear. Self-care is not manis and petties and massages.
Those are nice though.
Those are nice. That's self-maintenance though, not self-care. Self-care is really about like emotionally, physically, spiritually, what recharges me? How do I replenish my battery? Because again, I can't be empathetic with you if I'm at half capacity. I'm too much in self-preservation mode at that point, right? My fuse is about an inch long. And, think about when you've ever been tired and hungry and you try to parent, for example. Like, I'm not a good parent when I'm tired and hungry. The worst. Clarity is actually empathetic. It's not just kind, as Brene Brown says, but when you are clear on expectations, on mission, on purpose, on values, and not just pretty posters on the wall, but what do those actually mean in action, in practice? People feel calmer. They feel less stress, less anxiety. I know what's expected of me. You can hold them accountable when you're clear on expectations, because you can't hold someone accountable to an expectation you haven't clearly set. So clarity, if you are clear as a leader, that's actually a form of practicing empathy, because you're looking at it from their point of view. What do they need to know? What do they need to understand? What can I show them about what's next and what's happening? Decisiveness is related to that. We often, in the name of empathy, delay tough decisions or tough conversations because we don't want to hurt someone's feelings. But what we end up doing is making it really stressful and anxious for everyone because we're holding them in limbo. They know something's going on. Be transparent, be clear, be transparent about what you know about the decision and what you don't. Be decisive, but solicit different points of view and input so that you can swiftly make a call. So it's not about being a dictator, decisiveness. It's about synthesizing all those points of view quickly and learning the art of that. And then, hey, we're making this call. Here's why we're making this decision. And we really considered all of your input. Brandon, you had a really great idea. The reason we weren't able to implement it as part of the solution is X, Y, and Z. But please keep those ideas coming because it was a really valuable conversation that we had considering what you offered up. That leaves room for you to disagree but commit rather than fight against it. And I now have encouraged you to give feedback in the future. I haven't discouraged you from doing it. And joy is an element that surprised me that I added in, that all of these leaders have some sort of an element of levity in their teams, even if the work is hard. It doesn't mean the work is joyful every moment. It just means they've created a sense of camaraderie, a sense of caring, a sense of like lightness where we can laugh at ourselves. We can do, we can have some goofy Slack channels. We can do some kooky team bonding, whatever we want to do, but we have a sense of camaraderie. And that increases engagement, that increases performance, it decreases absenteeism, all of this data around what it means to have a friend at work. So we want to inject that element of it. And one leader that I interviewed put it great, where he said, I try to find those, he's like, I'm not the funniest guy, but I don't have to do it all myself. I can get ideas from the team and just encourage and create an atmosphere where the team can bring their own levity. And because I do that, when I make big, hard asks, they trust me because they know that I wouldn't be asking unless it was important. And I thought that was a really astute observation.
That is. I think this is in the chapter about self-awareness, and you must have had somebody call this woo-woo. But any of these could really be called that. What do you say to people who dismiss any of these as woo-woo or some other term?
Well, that's why I wrote the first book, The Empathy Edge, because it was fine, you need a business case. Here's your business case. This is not fluffy. This is
here's raw data.
Here's raw data that shows that when you have an empathetic leader or an empathetic culture, it boosts engagement, it boosts innovation, it boosts performance, it boosts customer revenue and customer loyalty. It boosts collaboration by so many different vectors. And there's one report that stands out to me because they did a study, I think it was from Catalyst, and they put people into two groups that said they had an empathetic leader and groups that said their leader was not empathetic. And then they asked them the same questions. And the delta, for example, of just, I can be innovative at work. With the people that had an empathetic leader, it was 61%. With those that didn't, it was 13%. That's bottom line productivity and money to your company.
Mm-hmm.
That is revenue right there. That is engagement. That is longevity. That is loyalty. That is all of those things that actually impact your chance of success and hitting your goals. So is it woo woo? Maybe, but when we talk about business as just a collection of people collaborating to get something done, then you have to pay attention. You have to pay attention to the people issues. Yeah.
You challenge the myth that empathy is a one-way street from leaders to employees. And I get why people would think that, but I think the how behind, like, how do you make it mutual is the challenge that many people have, especially if you're a younger, newer generation, lower level employee, like, how do you open up to a leader and then vice versa? Maybe leaders feel uneasy about that too. So how do we make that, that shift to a mutual empathy?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing is making sure that you're modeling it and you're rewarding it and you're celebrating it. You have to put your money where your mouth is, right? So if you're going to say empathy is a value, or you want to create a more empathetic culture, what are you actually doing to show people that that's how they can find success there? So that's number one, is if you're a leader and you're acting with empathy, you're setting the tone for how you want your team to interact without saying a word. But also, I think that, to your point about younger generations, there's conflicting studies. It's kind of interesting. Some studies show, like, the younger generations are the least empathetic we've ever had, and it's because of screens, and it's because of this and that. Others say they are one of the most empathetic generations that we have because they are more connected to the world. They can connect with each other. They have more access to information. So you can pick whichever survey suits your point of view, I guess.
Confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias in action, right? But also we need to remember that, and this is what I learned from Anna Liotta, who I spoke to you about, the generational expert, when I had her on my podcast, The Empathy Edge, is I learned that, yes, there is a point where we may have to train and teach younger generations about empathy and what it looks like at work. Because some of these generations grew up in environments where they never had to worry about the adults in their lives. Everything was taken care of for them, and for good motive and good reason.
Yeah.
But when you're in an environment like that, you don't learn to worry about someone that's quote unquote superior to you. You think they've got it all figured out. And so now you come into a workplace and you're like, well, I don't have to be empathetic to my boss. Why would I have to be empathetic to my boss? They know everything. So it's, this is going to sound a little self-serving, and I don't mean it to. However, you want to train and upskill your people at every level to understand what empathy is and what it isn't and what it looks like and how to practice it. But the thing that's going to give you the biggest bang for your buck is what I said earlier, which is, do you have a culture where it is talked about, where it is modeled, where it is celebrated, where it's rewarded?
Yeah, gosh, that's so interesting, because it makes me believe that, and this is for lack of a better term, but like, we all kind of grow up in bubbles, our own little world, and then we get to the workplace and it's messy, and we're all coming from different cultural norms, and then now we're in this one like common culture, and now we've got to learn to connect and understand each other, and it's hard, like, good leaders figure it out.
They do, and they create an environment where you're allowed to be different. You can bring that different, and it actually adds to the success of the team. But you can't just bring different and not have empathy. I come into a lot of companies sometimes through the DEIB route, because some of their initiatives don't stick, because you can't have inclusion without empathy. Otherwise you have just a bunch of different people who don't understand each other sitting around a table, right? So without empathy as a mindset shift and as a leadership skill, you can't harness the value of those differences. And we've all seen data that shows that the more diverse your leadership team, the more diverse your team, the better business decisions you make, because you can see risks or opportunities that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. But how do you harness that benefit? You have to have empathy. It's got to be the fuel that makes the whole engine run.
What advice do you have for leaders who struggle with reconciling this whole idea about empathy, but with the need of having like tough situations like layoffs or reorg, change management, like all these like things that are like not so fun?
Yeah.
how do we be empathetic through those situations?
Yeah. I mean, that's why there's the pillar of clarity. There's the pillar of decisiveness. There's the pillar of joy, is also because those decisions are not going to change just because someone's unhappy with them. And so again, that's another naive thinking, but it's that's when it becomes the how you can still make that decision, but how are you making that decision? And I tell the story of one of my most empathetic bosses who actually had to lay off the entire marketing team in advance of a sale. And it was the way he did it that makes it empathetic. It wasn't a decision we wanted. It wasn't a decision he wanted, but he was thoughtful before he came to us. What questions might they have? What resources might they need? What support can I provide? How can I explain this to them in a clear, transparent way? Right? He was ready with all that because he's like, if I were them, what would I want to know? How might I be feeling? He thought about it from that perspective. And so it came through in the delivery of that news. And he is still a mentor and even a trusted co-colleague to this day. I interviewed him for the new book because he's gone on to be very successful, and he's had to do several hard layoffs like this. And his motto is always give people as much information as possible, provide as much support as possible, think about what questions they have and be ready to answer them, and make space for their emotions, make space for their anger or their frustration or their sadness. And sometimes all that's required, the action I was talking about earlier, is to just sit and listen, to just listen. If it's appropriate, give a hug. If it's, whatever you're allowed to do within your culture and your workplace. Yeah. But that's sometimes the action is doing nothing at all, but listening and making space for someone and following up with them. One of the things he did for his team was, I will send you guys job leads. I will refer you to my network. I will provide references, like whatever you need, I'm here for you. Just because you're going away, I'm still here. So it didn't change the decision. It was the way that it was done that left the good feelings, left us feeling supported, left us feeling listened to. And that's how you maintain those relationships going forward.
This has been such an awesome conversation. So as we wrap this up, what's one action item or a takeaway that you want listeners to leave this conversation with? And I hope they would go get the book, because there's so much more we didn't even come close to touching. And then what's way to contact you or follow your work, anything like that?
I would just encourage them to help their leaders understand that empathy is a strength, not a weakness. You have to actually be very strong to be able to take on someone else's perspective without defensiveness or fear. And if they can help train them or talk about it with them in a way that is accessible to whoever they are. Leaders come in all different flavors, right? We've got the analytical left brain folks. We've got the creative, emotional right brain folks. We've got everyone in between. So finding ways, if not me, another empathy trainer to come in and talk about it, but really build a curriculum around emotional intelligence and creating that resiliency and that trust. It's not, I always joke, I wish my 1-2 hour workshop could solve all your culture problems, but that's impossible.
It's ongoing.
So making sure that it's not a one hit wonder. We checked a box. We did a training, or we did some support around that, and now we're done. So that I would just leave folks with that. And, I help some of my clients with that, with sort of advising, hey, let's look at a curriculum that you could put together with different areas of expertise or different areas that skills your team needs to build. And folks can connect with me at theempathydilemma.com, which is actually the book page on my website. So if they go to my website, Red-Slice, they'll find all my services. They'll find my blog. They can sign up for my newsletter. And at theempathydilemma.com, they can get a free chapter of the book if they want to check it out first. And also I'm on LinkedIn and I'm on Instagram, Red-Slice Maria. LinkedIn is Maria J. Ross. I would love for them to connect.
My guest today has been Maria Ross, the author of The Empathy Dilemma, How Successful Leaders Balance Performance, People, and Personal Boundaries. Maria, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Brandon.